Okay, we will convene the Intergovernmental Relations Committee at 7:27. Present are committee members Glassburn and Heeman, as well as council members, Council President Jones, Kelly, Williamson, Broussard, and Lippert. Mayor, Law and Finance, Chief Swagner, and Shep, Director of Planning, and HR, and guests. Today we have on the agenda 2021-21, which is the electronic meeting code section, and then also 2021-25, the Fairview Park prison contracts. My guess is more of the audience is here for the prison contracts, so I'll take that first. I want to give Chief Wagner an opportunity if he wants to say anything first, and then I have a couple of thoughts I'd like to share, and if there are others who want to make comments or questions, then we'll go ahead. Chief, is there anything you'd like to add or anything you'd like to say?
Not unless, I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, and not unless there are additional questions for me that we didn't go over at the previous meeting. I'm good, sir.
Okay, thanks, Chief. Speaking for myself, and I've heard concerns from others, working our dispatch with Fairview Park is something that sounds like a good idea, as well as the jail, and we want a way to make this work. Having the jail fee at $65, though, when we know that is below our costs, and we know that other communities almost universally charge $125, is hard to justify to residents. We know that we're making that up on the dispatch. I guess I'm frustrated that we got this at this point where there was no longer any flexibility for us to talk about it or basically have to do yes or no. So I will be voting yes on this, but I don't know why this wasn't better research before it was brought to us. Are there any comments or questions from committee? Councilwoman Heeman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Chief Wagner, I will also be voting yes on this. I think it's important for the dispatch. We are disappointed, more than one of us, I think, about the value of the prisoner portion of the contract. And, you know, perhaps there could have been a different negotiation with, you know, some of the funding on the dispatch side being, you know, able to be moved to increase the prisoner side. You know, we're just never privy to any of that information or discussions. So unfortunately, while it's probably not a suitable prisoner contract for us, I don't want to hold it up for you for the dispatch. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman Heeman. Are there any other comments or questions from council? Mr. Kelly.
I also would like to see the dispatch go forward. I'm not happy at the $65 rate per prisoner. So now after this last presentation we had, if the jail is shut down and let's say we had Fairview prisoner at that time, and the Fairview prisoner had to go to Westlake, and we're charging $65 for that prisoner now, and if Westlake charges $125, who's going to eat that difference? Is my question.
I think that's a fair enough question. Chief Wagner or someone from administration would like to try to take a stab at that.
So I haven't, like I said, I haven't talked with Chief Belozer yet regarding taking our prisoners. As of, we're not sure that we're going to be able to move forward with the, you know, we originally had planned for a July 1 start date to take over Fairview Park Dispatch we're starting to run short on time, and with this jail plumbing project taking longer than initially anticipated, we may be pushed off until the third quarter or even January 1 of 2022 at this point in time. I've got some staffing needs that I need to make happen also to make the new dispatch be staffed appropriately. So, all that kind of stuff takes time. So we might not be starting Fairview Dispatch until after the jail plumbing project. I don't know that for sure, but like I said, it's one of the things that we're discussing right now is an actual live start date. July 1 is going to be tough to meet.
Thank you, Chief. Is Fairview, I mean, under this agreement, it appears we're contracted to provide these services. Is Fairview indicated that they would be okay with a delay, or have we had that conversation yet?
I have talked with Chief Shepard on occasion. He knows that we have certain things that we have to have in place before we can go forward with this. We're only going to have one shot at this, so we want to make sure that it's done right, because if we fail, it's not going to be good for us. It's not going to be good for Fairview. So we want to make sure that when we do start this project, it's going to work.
Mr. Kelly?
Yeah, I have one other question. So we get this contract for the $65 per day per prisoner from Fairview Park. And then let's say that other cities within our area, I'll just call it our lodge area, the departments that are around here in West Shore, suddenly have a problem with their jail. And they say, well, why would we send our prisoner to North Royalton for $125? Why would we send it to Bay for $125? Hey, North Olmsted, why don't you take our prisoner for $65? I mean, I don't know. I think this is setting a bad precedent. I think it's a bad deal for North Olmsted, and that's the way I feel about it.
Chief, if you'd like to respond, or from the administration, then Councilwoman Heeman. Chief,
so originally,
okay.
this was a package deal, which it still is. And when it was, both deals were combined, I understand that Fairview separated the legislation into a jail contract as well as a dispatch contract, and our council did the same. I completely understand that. And when this was put together as a package, it wasn't separated like we've done now. We had built-in profit across the board, and now that we separate it out, that obviously shows that the prisoner side is quote unquote losing money.
Thank you, Chief. Councilwoman Heeman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Chief Wagner, I want you to know that we're fully supportive of everything that you need. We are. It's unfortunate that the administration is not speaking up. Perhaps our council president could work with you on those contracts to see where, they could be moved a little bit, some of the money to one place or the other, and make it all more palatable, and drill down some of the details for us, so that you're not shortchanged, you're not worried we're not going to support your needs, and that you're also not being held up on your plumbing project and some other things. So I know that perhaps sometimes our committee chairs have jumped into things, but this seems to be a little bit more of a global issue. And so, Council President Jones, are you able to help us and guide that for us?
Absolutely, yes.
Councilman Limpert.
Yeah, thanks, Chief. I think it's important to understand, I think it's easy to look at something as strictly a fee-based, profit expense calculation. I would think that, I think the Chief's laid it out pretty well. There's other intangible benefits here, and are really strategic and provide opportunity for growth by bringing a partnership on board as it relates to the dispatch component, as well as just, jail utilization. So I think there's components there that shouldn't be lost when we look at the fee, that this really does enable a lot of intangibles and put us in a position of better strategic opportunity by making such a collaborative agreement with Fairview. So it's easy to get caught up on the specific cost per prisoner and say, are we making or losing money? But there's other costs broader involved in here, as well as sort of the package collaboration between dispatch and jail that I don't think should be lost when we try to communicate the cost per prisoner. You can't just look at one number out of a whole package and say whether it's positive or negative. It really is a holistic solution. So thanks.
Councilman Limpert, I appreciate the point you're making about the dispatch. I think we're all in agreement that the dispatch is a net positive for what we're looking to do. The problem is it appears we went into this negotiation, however it came to pass, without knowing what our costs were. And by having these as separate deals, it exposes us, even if it's inadvertently, to unintended consequences, which is what we see with, Councilman Kelly's questions about Fairview. What we're seeing with this plumbing issue. I mean, if Fairview is going to benefit from having us do dispatch, we now have to delay that service so that it can be concurrent with the jail. I mean, it's because of the fees. Each item doesn't pay for itself. So it's just sloppy. That's the problem. Councilman Limpert?
Yeah, just so I'm clear. So Chief, are you saying that we could break free from one component of the agreement without the other, the way it's written?
I'm not saying that. Fairview, it's an all or nothing for the deal with Fairview.
Okay, so Mr. Glassburn, it sounds like that doesn't create a problem of them being separate and creating a problem where we'd have a loss for prisoners. I'm just trying to understand how this is going to work, because I think Mr. Glassburn brings up a good point. If this doesn't work out, are we going to get stuck with prisoners and in dispatch? We don't have the dispatch, which from my understanding from previous conversations, that's not the case. So I'm just trying to make sure I understand that the way it's been presented to council is there's a combined effort here of a mutual package of dispatch and prisoner support that in the overall scheme of the whole package is a net positive for the city, that you can't break from one of them without breaking the other, which would mean we wouldn't be on the hook for just jail support and have dispatch walk away unless there was a whole new contract designed. And that also the last thing is that there is a strategic benefit here as it relates to bringing on dispatch to North Olmsted, as it relates to a broader, goal within the county and within the overall dispatching centers to consolidate dispatch, right? So I just want to make sure I have this understanding, because I'm hearing a lot about it's sloppy or it's not a positive for the city, and I want to make sure I understand that, because my understanding is we shouldn't be looking at the cost per prisoner in a single line item component. We should be looking at this as an overall opportunity case of dispatch and prisoners. So Chief or the mayor, am I thinking about this right, or am I misunderstanding this, in that we should be looking at specifically prisoner cost?
So when we got into the talks with Fairview, we wanted to see this as a partnership. If we just took on, if Fairview was willing to split the baby and just give us dispatch and not take their prisoners, having prisoners is an evil necessity. I don't like it any more than probably every other police chief that has to run a jail. But frankly, we're paying our overhead regardless. If Fairview were to leave, we still have the same correction officers on staff. We're still paying the same electricity bills. Fairview's taking care of the $65 a day, and they're also paying the prisoner meals, squad runs, all the stuff that goes on top of it. So that $65 a day, although yes, it's lower than the going rate, that's kind of why we did it as a partnership. And that's on top of what we're going to be paying whether we have Fairview Dispatch or not, or Fairview Dispatch in jail or not.
Thank you, Chief. I do want to note, Councilman Lippert, I understand the global point of that we have the deals are tied together in terms of one doesn't function without the other. But on a technical basis, I want folks to understand that these are two separate documents. In theory, one could be opted out of. In all likelihood, if one was opted out of by one city, the other city would opt out of the other one. Yes, they are tied, but I want to make sure we understand the structure. Councilman Kelly, you've had your hand up for a long time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's kind of ironic that we just talked about EMS fees, to raise the EMS fees so that they're standardized with the other communities that are around us. But yet we're almost half priced in the way it looks for the prisoners. And I understand that the two of them go together, but from the outside looking in, say, okay, we just raised our EMS fees because that's standard. And standard right now for prisoners is $125 a day, but no, we're going to do 65. And I just think it's a bad look. Thanks.
Councilwoman Heeman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Chief Wagner, we are supportive. The plan was to take in more dispatch. I know that when we were, doing the tours and we were expanding the space, and that legislation was coming forward, we did plan to want to be able to take in more dispatch for, so here we are doing it. I think that perhaps, we should hold this and go to work at it a little bit more to see if perhaps a little bit of a different deal could be made so that dispatch, maybe some of that money can come over into the prisoner portion and see if there isn't something that can be moved and we still have them both, and that the prisoner portion is at a little bit more palatable of a rate. We can work at that with you. I think that, all Fairview can do is say no, but until they're approached and we talk about that with them, I don't know that, they would look at it as that way, trying to maybe structure the money a little bit differently. Thank you, Mr. Glassburn.
Mr. Limpert.
Yeah, so I got a question for Mr. Mayor, the law director, on why we would split up the legislation then if it needs to be package deal, because now we're opening ourselves up to some confusion and conflicting of passing one and the other. I don't know why we just didn't have it a combined package.
Mr. Law Director.
Thank you. We have a history in the past several months of legislation having more than one subject in it, and having given consideration to a conversation with Mr. Schuman, it was a decision made by myself that we could have two of them in two separate pieces of legislation. Whether they're combined and you have to pass one or pass both is irrelevant. The issue is that they've been presented to you as a package. If you choose to vote for one and not the other, we're not going to have a contract because Fairview Park won't sign it, we won't sign it, and that'll be the end of that. So the history of why we have two pieces of legislation is it was a discussion that I had with Mr. Schuman about whether or not this needed to be in one piece or could be in two pieces, and after it was written by me, I gave it further consideration, as I think I explained in a previous email, that I gave it further consideration and felt that it should be presented in two pieces, after I'd also already seen that the city of Fairview Park had presented it in two separate pieces of legislation as well. So that decision was my decision. It doesn't affect whether or not it was whether it's one piece or two piece. It's a package deal. It could be two pieces of legislation, one piece of legislation. It's a package. So if you choose to vote for one and not the other, there won't be a contract. The Fairview Park won't sign it. We won't sign it, and that would probably be the end of that. So I don't know that there's any other explanation for it other than what I just described as it was a procedural question that was presented and discussed, and it was considered by myself and presented to you in a different format.
Thank you, Director Guro.
Thank you.
Am I seeing any other comments or questions? Okay. Councilwoman Heeman, since we are the only ones here from the committee tonight, if you'd like to move forward, let me know. If you would like to hold it, let me know.
Yeah, I would prefer, thank you, Chairman Glassman. I would prefer to hold it and let's look at this. I'd like to talk a little bit more directly with the chief if I might, because I didn't really see, how this came to us, right? I don't know who went to Fairview. Fairview came to us. I'd like to know a little bit more of those details. And then I'd like to consult, I think I mentioned Council President Jones perhaps, helping with some of this as well. So yeah, I think holding it would be my preference. Thank you.
Councilwoman Williamson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Are we under a deadline to get this contract signed? I guess
Go ahead, Chief.
If we were looking to go for the soonest start date as possible, that would be the only thing. But no, I mean, if it doesn't go through council, then Fairview will continue to operate the way they continue to operate now, the way they're operating now.
Councilwoman Williamson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Are we at risk, though, of losing Fairview Park to another city if we delay this?
Fairview Park originally got a quote from Rocky River. They like our services and our dispatch center better than Rocky River. I believe right now Rocky River operates their dispatch just with all part-time employees. They're also currently building a new police station. So they did get a quote, from my understanding, from Rocky River, and they elected to do business with North Olmsted. Whether that would change if this didn't move forward, I'd have to talk to Chief Shepherd in Fairview Park to see if they would continue to operate the way they are or would look elsewhere, whether it be Chagrin Valley or Southwest Dispatch or another web city.
Thank you, Chief. Councilman Kelly.
I'm not on your committee, so it really doesn't matter what I think. But if you're going to hold this in committee, I don't think I would hold it too long so that the two don't get separated by too big of a gap and we still have an opportunity to go forward on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly. Councilwoman Williamson.
Sorry, Mr. Chair. Apparently I was muted before and I didn't know it. I would also like to see us, move rather quickly in getting this, pushed through so we don't lose the opportunity to bring Fairview over, because I'm afraid then we're going to end up having to go somewhere else with ours. Thank you.
Councilwoman Heeman.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, if you want to, move this forward, we can. I still think there still might be some time, to make an amendment on the floor, because we wouldn't be holding it that long anyway. So I'd be in favor of that if that's your preference as the chair. It seems to be, a preference of some of the council members.
Thank you. Are there any other comments or questions? Okay, seeing none and hearing what I think is a consensus, I'm going to move that we recommend 2021-25 to full council and ask for a second. Seconded by Councilman Heeman. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. 2-0. Okay. All right. The second item on our agenda tonight is 2021-21, the new electronic meeting code section. The last time we spoke on this, we had folks wanting to look at this more. Director Guro said he might have some ideas as well. We received, or I received at least, some notes from Director Lieber. Are there any comments, or before I address some of the suggestions by Director Lieber. Are there any other comments or thoughts from members? I'll start with committee first. Councilwoman Heeman? No?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You know what, I'll defer to other members for the moment. I did look at Director Lieber's comments, but I am somewhat of a believer in that, you know, you have to be on screen, you have to be vocal. And of course, I still think if you have a residency requirement attached to your position, that you need to be in the city limits for that. However that works out, because it's a residency requirement for your job. But I will defer to other folks for now. Thanks.
Thank you. Rest of council. Mr. Broussard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a follow-up to Councilwoman Heeman's comments. It seems that I haven't really gotten any rationale as to why the push for needing to be physically present in the city during virtual meetings, other than it's an opinion, because I couldn't think of any legal or moral issues or conflict of interest issues. So I did check with the law department on those same subjects, and they share my opinion that there's no legal or moral or conflict of interest issues related to not physically being present in the city of North Olmsted during a virtual meeting. So I'm just kind of looking for clarity as to why that is so important to a couple of people. Otherwise, Councilwoman Williamson brought up a very good point during our last meeting that, we're at the mercy of, during virtual meetings, we're at the mercy of, IT. And sometimes IT, as we have found out over the last 14 months, does not do its job, doesn't work as well as you hope and expect it to. So, sometimes my mother-in-law lives literally a 2-minute drive away from me, but she's actually in the city of Westlake. I could go over there, and I have gone over there during meetings because for whatever reason, her internet service sometimes is better than mine. And that would make me in violation, even though I'm 2 minutes away from where I reside. So for me, the restriction just seems whimsical more than factual. So that's my opinion. Thanks for listening.
So I want to remind folks, and so far we've done so politely, but let's try not to make this too much of questioning each other and focus on what we want to see done. Councilwoman Heeman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm happy to go a little deeper into the statement, and that would be, so for example, if the makeup of council, maybe not this one, but another, were such that, they could vote to have a virtual meeting, folks could actually be snowbird type council people. You could have a home somewhere else and, every other month or so vote to have virtual meetings and be at that residence and not in your residence in the city. City Hall also does always have power. And I did not have power one time, and I had to go to City Hall in order to be in the meeting. My neighbor had power. I could have maybe gone there. I could have maybe gone, to somebody in another city. But knowing that our municipal building does in fact run and is operational, I believe that is then where folks should go that have residency requirements. But more likely for the reason that, our legislation doesn't say specifically in an emergency, specifically in floods, pandemics, whatever. It's just at the vote of council, a majority. So that would be my reason for wanting that local requirement to continue, so that other councils perhaps would not become more lenient in the rules for their own personal desires. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilwoman Heeman. Councilman Broussard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a quick follow-up. If we're having virtual meetings, it's because there's a majority of council that doesn't feel comfortable being at City Hall. or for any other reason. We're having virtual meetings for a reason. So I don't necessarily agree with that opinion, but thank you.
Thank you, Councilwoman Williamson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank
I think that what most of us have learned is that we can do our jobs remotely from anywhere. And while I don't necessarily mean that council will forever be on, virtual, what I mean in saying that is that given the circumstances that we've seen over the past year, many of us have been displaced with our jobs. Some of us have been working from home. Some of us have been working elsewhere. But if we choose, if we're not within city limits during a meeting, yet we're still attending virtual meetings, I don't see why we should be punished for that. I think that you're taking time out of whatever it is that you're doing to participate and to continue to do your duties as a council representative, even if you are not within the city limits. So for those reasons, I would object to keeping that in and just remaining as, virtual and not putting city limits on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman Williamson. Councilwoman Heyman?
Thank you. I'd like to propose an amendment then that we actually have to have, some purpose that is relative to the physical, safety, health, and welfare of the members of the body to then move into electronic meetings. Right now, the legislation just says that at the vote of 5 members, it doesn't. So it seems discretionary rather than there would be some causation to have to do that or need to do that. So perhaps that's the compromise, is that the language is amended so that there is some reason for us to have electronic meetings.
Thank you, Councilwoman Heyman. During the charter review process, Council President Jones and I were the ones to offer the starting points on this legislation. I believe both of us had something about emergency clauses, but or emergency reasons for doing this. It was brought up in the Charter Commission, I believe unanimously, came to the conclusion that council should exercise discretion and do this, make that decision as a body. So I am somewhat reluctant, since we went through that process and that was specifically discussed. But I do think it's a fair idea to consider. I don't want to lose sight of the rest of the provisions, though. They may seem small and bureaucratic here, but whether we wait 15 minutes or 30 minutes or 20 minutes for things are things that matter in this legislation as well. So yeah, are there more comments on the residency question, or can we move on to other topics for the moment? And I'll preface that with, I'm inclined to probably hold this tonight, but I want to make as much progress as possible so that we're not delaying this unnecessarily. Okay, Councilman Lippert, I previously saw you had a hand up. Is there anything you'd like to add?
No, I mean, I just would like to say, I mean, I appreciate Ms. Heeman's comment about a concern of, somebody who is, repetitively not in the city for an extended period of time. I think there's maybe other ways we can look at that from a rules of council or from a public record standpoint that would address that without requirements of the meeting, but just in general to, better encourage people to be present within the city that they represent whenever they can, right? So that's all. But I don't think it necessarily has to be in the resolution here.
So I'll remind folks, I think from a previous meeting, the vehicle for the residency issue, if we are to take that up, makes the most sense in terms of the rules of council, because our boards and commissions do not have residency requirements and sometimes almost explicitly require people who aren't from the city. So that is probably the proper venue. I understand it's relevant to the overall discussion here, so that's why I've been going through it. But I will say I do think that that is the correct vehicle should we take action on that front. Councilwoman Williamson.
I have more of just a comment. Or maybe I do have a question. Would we be on an honor-based system, or how would we be verifying who's where? You know, how would we know if someone's within the city limits? I could change up a room and you wouldn't know where I was.
So to Councilman Williamson's point, I doubt there's a pragmatic way to verify locations. I think you all are familiar with the most organized part of my home, but that would be problematic. But it occurs to me that if we were going to set a geographic limitation, it could do something slightly larger, like Cuyahoga County. But it feels like we're going into the weeds by there. So I don't want to jump into picking subdivisions yet. If we decide we want to do that direction, we'll figure out what makes the most sense. Councilman Kelly.
Just a quick comment. I mean, Mr. Limpert used to have a sign behind him. The city was in North Olmsted. I'm not sure where he is tonight. Maybe a museum. Okay, there it is. All right, great.
5 feet over. Didn't even know.
The Limpert exhibit is alive and well. Okay. So are we ready to move on to other topics, at least before we come back to this if we need to? Okay. So I will give Director Lieber her due. She did present us with some written comments. So Director Lieber, if you would like to make any comments on your written, a couple of yours jump out to me that I would like to see done, but quite honestly, I didn't have a lot of time with it and haven't fully absorbed them. So Director Lieber, if you'd like to, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the opportunity. I guess I characterize many of my comments as housekeeping in nature, where I just felt verbiage could be changed to help the understanding of the reader. So I was not trying to change the intent, but just to clarify the language for ease of understanding. So those were the changes that I suggested in Section 1 and Section 4. I had some question about being excused from a meeting and just some of that language being a little bit specific. I also thought that there might have the Section 5B 2, 3, and 4. I wasn't sure if the intent where it talks about during voting that the meeting can be recessed for not less than 5 minutes or until the member rejoins. It doesn't give a maximum, so I was wondering if that was just a written error, if it meant not more than, because it doesn't indicate how long the roll call can be postponed. So I thought perhaps that was just a writing error. Down in number 8, when a quorum is lost due to a member losing connectivity, it gives a 30-minute time frame by which that member can reconnect. I just felt that was very long when you're thinking of applicants for boards and commissions, residents waiting. I was just thinking of how long we gave our professors in college to show up before you'd scoot out the class door. So I felt something less, and I don't have necessarily a recommendation of time, but I guess I'd recommend something less just for the flow of the meeting. And then also toward the end, Section 9A and B, there's language in one but not the other that allows a chairperson discretion to allow someone attending the meeting to share information that wasn't previously provided to the clerk, so long as that it's provided afterwards. And I think that that same discretion should be in both sections, both for the applicant and for any guest. I was thinking of residents attending board and commission meetings where they may have not had an opportunity to provide that feedback ahead of time. So those were the more substantive ones are the ones I outlined, but I had some other just language ones council could consider or not. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Lieber. I'm going to try to tackle these one at a time. And so let me go to the more conceptual ones first. Well, we'll start with the one that Director Lieber just said. There is a provision that the meetings can continue or has to wait 30 minutes. Director Lieber suggested the collegiate 15 model. That may be generous in some schools, might be 10 in others. Is there thoughts about that point? Councilman Lippert.
I mean, I would agree 30 minutes is probably a little long, and that something like 15 makes more sense, or 10.
Okay. Councilwoman Williamson, did you have a point before I went on this that you'd like to address? Okay. Councilwoman Heeman.
Thank you. 30 minutes, I think, is a very long time. We could actually lose 2 more members by the time the first one comes back. So I would be open to shortening that time frame.
Okay. I'll take a straw poll. Are folks okay with 15 minutes? Yes. Okay. Does anyone want it to be 10? All right. So I will include 15 minutes in whatever amendment we offer. Okay. On the point of, I'll go back, try to do this at the beginning. I agree with Director Lieber that some of her first comments are more housekeeping. The first one from the beginning, I think that is more substantive, is changing the excusal from the chairperson, changing the word to unless excused by a chairperson of the municipal body or for a short restroom break. She suggests permitted, and she suggests that the restroom be omitted. I would tend to agree that we don't need to specify what type of break people are having, but does anyone care about the permitted, excused preferences? Councilwoman Heeman.
Maybe those are strong words, but generally, you would just kind of even, in council chambers, raise your hand and sort of excuse yourself and go. I don't know that the reason is required or necessary. I would agree with that. But that seeking permission from the chair and or at least acknowledgement perhaps from the chair, I think is suitable.
Okay. Councilman Kelly.
I think if it just said short break, remove the restroom, that's probably a good idea.
Would you prefer to say short or just say break? I believe the way it reads right now is, oh yeah, I'm sorry, short is the modifier right before it. So we're in agreement, never mind, my mistake.
Whether it says short break or it just says break, either way, doesn't matter to me.
Okay. Councilman Lippert.
Yeah, I guess my only question, and this would, Ms. Jones may be able to give a better perspective of whether she would want to be kind of interrupted from the flow of a meeting, or a chair, any chair, I guess, or whether some comment in the chat could suffice to note that you're stepping away. That's just my, just a question for other people's input.
Council President Jones, if you want to address.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, to the councilman. I feel that this legislation should remain as broad as possible, because it is addressing how the city is going to handle this for all boards and commissions in addition to council. And then if we want to drill down deeper into council rules, or if certain boards and commissions here in the city have a preference, if the people who are on those boards at that time, when they're setting up their their rules for how to run their meetings and that type of thing. I think those types of issues should be dealt directly then with those boards and commissions, because my preference on how things should be handled. So for example, I would say if I'm running a meeting and someone puts something in the chat area, I'm kind of relying on our clerk to be monitoring that for me. And so that wouldn't be my preference. I would prefer that a member would address me directly, but someone else running a different meeting might feel differently.
Thank you, President Jones. Councilwoman Heeman.
Yeah, I don't know exactly how softly to do that, if you will. But I think what happens sometimes is screens go dark. You don't know if the person's in attendance or not. Now you're reporting attendance of a meeting. So I think there needs to be some recognition that that person is, stepped out, excused, absent for the moment. I don't know how best to term it. Maybe somebody else has a better idea, but I think it would avoid the, screen going dark and where'd they go kind of thing that now we just don't know.
Okay. I think that's probably a valid point. Not that anyone else's isn't, just that I agree. Are there any other comments on the issue of permitted versus excused and the restroom question, or the issue of having to ask the chairperson and be recognized for a break? Okay. I think we have a consensus on eliminating the word restroom. I think I'm hearing indifference on the excused versus permitted, but if anyone wants to tell me that they feel differently, I'm open. Okay, on the issue of the chair having to recognize, I would prefer the chair or the way we have it to stay. I think I heard that from Councilman Heeman. I'm hearing no from Councilman Limpert. Does anyone else want to weigh in on that? Okay, not hearing any, then I'm inclined to leave it be. Let's see, moving on. So Director Lieber brings on page 3 up the question of when we're awaiting someone that has fallen off the meeting, do we want it to be not more than 5 minutes versus not less than? I'll confess, the way I read the provision was that it was a protection of sorts to the person who fell off the meeting, that for them to know that they have up to 5 minutes and hopefully panic slightly less as they try to dial in or do whatever else they need to do. I would want to keep a minimum at there. If there's a maximum as well, so be it. But does anyone else have thoughts? Okay, Councilman Lippert.
Yeah, I'm trying to understand that again. So this was the amount of time that the person had to be able to dial back in to record their vote, right?
Yes, the language is, so if someone came off, if a member has not voted, then the meeting shall be recessed by the chairperson for not less than 5 minutes or until the member rejoins, to give the voting member a chance to rejoin the meeting. And then there's similar provisions with the same wording.
Yeah. I would say just you said 4 or 5 minutes, or 5 to 7 minutes. Again, you start getting 10 minutes, etc. Now you're talking, an extended absence in the meeting. I mean, some meetings only go 40 minutes here, but I think the point is to give that 5 minutes so the person's going to be able to dial back in, because usually that happens at the worst possible time. But I do think there should be sort of a max guidance as well. So, I mean, I think if you just say 4 or 5 minutes, that's perfectly reasonable in my opinion.
Okay, Council President Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If the law director could please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think then under the next section, though, it is addressed because it says if the member has not voted and is not able to reconnect after X amount of minutes, then the chair will continue the vote. And I know to Councilman Lippert's point, you don't want to give a lot of time, but then on the other hand, as we've expressed tonight, sometimes when you're trying to reconnect or, find a signal or whatever the issue is that you're having, it's, it might take 5 minutes to do that. I also understand that for the people sitting in the meeting, waiting for that person to reconnect, like 5 minutes seems like forever, right? We're all sitting here and we're just staring at each other, and it's a long time. But in reality, the person on the other end who's scrambling to try and get to this meeting, I guess what I'm trying to express is just let's make sure that we're being reasonable on both ends, to give people ample amount of time to reconnect due to whatever issue they're having, but then also be mindful of the people who are not having issues on their end and are sitting and kind of waiting for this meeting to continue.
Okay, Councilman Lippert.
So we treat it like we do with a resident speaking, of you'd make it 5 minutes, and then there's sort of the obligatory vote for up to 2 additional minutes. And by the time you get done with that, that's certainly like 9 minutes, but you're sort of procedurally moving it along and setting a standard that's already in place in other rules. And that way, it's sort of consistent with our, anyone speaking or anyone waiting, and it also defines a specific time. And it also sort of buys that individual a few extra minutes for everybody to do the obligatory, yes, you have 2 more minutes. And then it's not something different than what we do for usual protocol.
What are folks' thoughts on that? Director Lever?
I think I'm reminded, Mr. Chair, of Council President Jones' comments about thinking about this broadly. And just from my board and commission experience, they don't have those particular rules in place. So I guess I would just suggest not maybe making it more complicated in the section. And I see in that section 3 about if the member has not voted and is not able to connect after 5 minutes, that sets the maximum. So I guess that makes me feel like it was meant to read not more than, because it says or until the member rejoins. So, number 3 modifies both 2 and 5. So I just think for consistency, you're kind of setting a 5-minute cap. And that's how my brain works. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilman Lippert?
I'm fine with either. I'm just throwing ideas out there. So 5 minutes, or, I think 5 minutes is reasonable based on some of the other things we do as far as people speaking for 5 minutes, etc. And you usually can satisfy things within 5, or you have serious issues and you're probably going to be missing a lot longer of the meeting.
Thank you. Councilman Broussard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not trying to be funny, but what, kind of a splitting hairs question here. So what happens when somebody is present and then they experience some technical difficulty, and so they were present for part of the meeting, and then for whatever reason they just weren't able to reconnect? What does that mean from their attendance standpoint for that meeting? They were present, but then they weren't. Just curious. It's not important to me. I'm just curious more than anything else.
So, Councilman, I believe the legislation in terms of the votes, the votes stop obviously for that item and any subsequent that they are not present for. But in terms of the recording, we have our committee meetings, and some folks, stay for the first one and then leave for the second one, and so on. And we note the differences. I don't know that it would be useful for us to prescribe that if somebody how to mark attendance, but I'm open to suggestion, folks. Does anyone else wish to address that issue? Okay. Councilwoman Heeman.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't have an answer to that. I guess just the statement that, so for example, like when we are in our committee meetings and we're at, the city hall in our caucus room, if someone enters the meeting late or even online, when someone enters, we acknowledge the presence that, they've stepped into the meeting, like for the record, let the record reflect kind of statement. So I suppose that would generically perhaps be the same statement. And I don't know that we need a rule for that. We don't necessarily have one when we make the acknowledgement that someone has joined us. So I would think that, as Mr. Glassburn had stated, that, that's just part of the committee report of sorts, or that's the just generic business format that follows, that someone is there or not there. And that can be reported, I would think, as in attendance, technical difficulties, and, so I don't think I have a suggestion for a rule, but that if it were my committee meeting, I suppose that's the statement that I would make. Somebody has joined us, or somebody unfortunately has dropped off, and, and at least make it known that they were attempting to do the best that they could to be in attendance. Thank you.
Director Guerrero.
A little bit kind of following up on, I think, Councilman Broussard's comments. The question was, if 5 minutes goes on and the meeting continues and the member has missed a vote. Last meeting, I was tasked with the question, can a vote occur after the roll call if it doesn't change the outcome? And we do, and I think I mentioned at that point, but we do have Rule 23 in the Rules of Council that says any member having been unavoidably absent may at the next meeting be permitted to have his vote recorded upon any question acted upon during such absence, provided such vote shall not change the result. So I think that you could adjust your rules to provide that any member unavoidably absent for a vote can have his or her vote recorded either at the next meeting or at the conclusion of that meeting if it's an electronic meeting, as long as it doesn't change the outcome. I think you could answer that question about what happens if 5 minutes goes by and councilwoman hasn't rejoined. What happens? They could still have their vote recorded. However, they've missed the actual roll call vote for purposes of determining the outcome. But for the record, it could be noted that they've registered their vote on that particular question. So your rules already provide that in some capacity. You could tinker with the rules to change that a little bit so that if 5 minutes goes by and a council person hasn't rejoined, then their vote can be recorded. It just can't be counted because you've already announced that vote tally and you've moved on to the next question. But it can still be noted that they were there. So I think that's an okay way to address it. You'd have to tinker with Rule 23 a little bit to deal with what happens in the event that, look, they log out, the computer goes down, the power shoots out, the battery, like my computer's a brick tonight, I'm on another computer. If something goes wrong, then it can be, they can still have their vote recorded, but either at the next meeting or at the conclusion of that meeting if they rejoin. So I think that's an okay way to handle that too. All right, we've talked about what happens and how we're going to procedurally handle it, but the question is out there, what about the vote? Are they allowed to vote? And they could vote, but they just can't be counted in reversing the outcome anyways.
So, Director, for the most part this evening, we've heard arguments for not imposing council's concerns on boards and commissions because of we can do it through our rules. Is this something that perhaps is more suited for the legislation and not just the rules, because it would give more permission to the boards and commissions?
I don't know that any board or commission actually, as I can recall, has that rule where you can record your vote at the next meeting. I think that's strictly city council. I don't think any other board or commission has that option available. So if you're not there after 5 minutes and you're on planning and design commission, your vote doesn't count. And that's probably just as well. We can move on. But council with legislative matters, they treat them a little bit differently. So I think it's okay to leave it in the rules of council because it doesn't live anywhere else. If you put it in the legislation, you're kind of creating something that otherwise doesn't exist anywhere but for city council. So I think you could leave it in Rule 23, just play with 23, and it just says what happens in the event that you can't log back on. Just my thought.
Okay. So are folks ready to move on to the next substantive item? I don't want to keep folks here all night. Okay. So to my eyes, the last non-technical item that Director Lieber suggested was allowing a chairperson to allow an individual or a guest to share information that wasn't previously submitted to the clerk, and to submit that after they present their information to the body. What are folks' thoughts? So this may be a situation where we want to, again, consider whether we want to bifurcate the specifics of council versus imposing our situation on everybody else. I don't know. My initial reaction from a council perspective is that us providing information in advance is important to the public in terms of considering the legislation. And so I'm more reluctant to do it with council. I can see the usefulness of the boards and commissions being able to do this simply because you are, for the most part, talking about things like variances or fences or whatnot, where you have residents who are definitely not familiar with the process coming and trying to figure their way through our system. But Councilwoman Heeman.
I agree with that. Although at council, we have been provided residents who brought us photographs or, different other things. So I think it would be important for anyone to have the ability to share, whatever they have brought with them and or think that they need to present. I think that our public in general is not always as prepared as we are. But we have been approached at council, so I would think that's a good thing to leave in.
Okay. Are there any other folks with views on this? Okay. Council President Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just thinking while the councilwoman was talking, Councilwoman Heeman, I mean, so as you said, Mr. Chairman, this may be another instance of, do we want to keep this in this broad piece of legislation, or do we want to, allow for boards, commissions, and council to handle things differently? Because I would think that for some of our boards and commissions, if you're having an applicant come before you, you would expect them to be prepared or to have, the required documents or what have you. But as was just mentioned during our council meeting, sometimes a resident comes up a little bit less prepared and might have offhand pictures or something like that to share with council, which we've seen happen a handful of times before, and so that obviously wouldn't have been able to be presented to our clerk beforehand. So just something to throw out there for the members to think about as well.
President Jones. Any others wish to make a comment? Director Gurro.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My only question about the process where somebody appears at a meeting and wishes to share, and keep in mind, the proposal is that it's going to tell you on the meeting agenda notice that if you want to share information, you need to get it to the clerk before the meeting. So that's why that requirement's in there, so that somebody, if they want to share information, get it to the clerk so the clerk can share it. If somebody appears as a guest and has not in advance provided that information, let's say at a council meeting, I don't know the process by which you would be able to permit that guest to share it. We certainly wouldn't turn over the computer. I don't think we would turn over screen sharing to a guest who could control your meeting and put stuff on there that you haven't you know, I understand it's a free country and they're allowed to share things, but we've had instances in other communities where that doesn't go really well when other people get control of your screen. So I don't know how we would go about doing that. So I think, you know, perhaps with BZA, it might be a little bit different because somebody's showing up at a meeting and we might try to find a way to accommodate that because it's evidentiary and you have to permit people to provide evidence, and it has, for purposes of the case, may have some legal significance. I just what line do you want to walk where you provide somebody the opportunity to share information where we asked them in advance, we told them get it so we can get it up. We want you to share it, provide it to us, but how would they get that onto the screen to give to all of you at a council meeting if they didn't give it to the clerk before the meeting? I don't know the vehicle we would have to do that. If somebody has an answer to that, I'm happy to hear it because I can't think of one.
I think it's a fair point, Director Grow. Councilman Limpert.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Guerrero. I was actually going to say that, but I do think they can provide it to the clerk and that could still be shared during the meeting. So I would think the process would be that it would be vetted through the clerk and then the clerk would screen share. So if it couldn't be delivered to the clerk, then obviously we wouldn't be sharing it, but I think that would be the role of the clerk to vet that and be able to show that it's pertinent and share it.
It occurs to me that if we were trying to do this ad hoc and somebody had to email Chuck or email whomever is functioning as a clerk for a board, that it probably would take a few minutes for first the person to get the information where to send to Chuck or the board. I don't think we would want them to put files in the chat. Then the clerk would have to receive it, vet it. I mean, it might take maybe 3 or 4 minutes isn't that big of a deal, but to Council President Jones's point earlier, it feels like an eternity to everybody who's sitting there waiting for the meeting to proceed. Councilman Limpert.
Yeah, and I think it would be on the president to note that you can continue your comments, and you know, we typically get those pictures and then they get distributed anyway because they're just quickly passed, or the time it gets to all the council, the person's done speaking. But I'm just thinking if there's a venue, people are online obviously because they're on the meeting. So I would think while there could be some technology issues in sending an email, typically the clerk could probably drop his email in the chat and the person could send it. And by the time they're done talking, we'd at least have the pictures to understand what they're saying or whatever the diagram is, because again, there's not a lot of time to spend 5 minutes going over some ad hoc piece of material typically in our meetings.
Okay. Any more comments on this question? Okay, seeing none. I'm reluctant to make the change, but are there other folks that I know Councilman Limpert would like to? Are there others who would like to make the change that was recommended by Director Labor on this issue? Okay, I don't see any indications, so I will move on. The last item that I had on my list was the item that we've somewhat reviewed tangentially in this conversation, which was the question I had put to Director Guerrero, which he may not have additional information on, I don't know, which is whether we needed to make any changes regarding the ability to cast that vote after the fact. I think we addressed that already by the discussion on Rule 23 in Council, but if there's anything further on that point, Director, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I think that was the issue of 23, but there was one other question that you posed about voting that I went back and took a look at. And this question about people's microphone goes out and they start shaking their heads yes, or they do one of these. And so the way the charter reads is that it requires an affirmative vote, which I think would preclude a roll call vote when you do an affirmative vote. It doesn't seem to provide specifically on yays and nays. It's just that that's always what we deem to be an affirmative vote, call the roll, and who does the yays and nays. So I think that I'm kind of leaning toward the idea that you may be able to provide an affirmative vote via some method other than a specific vocal yay, that may be sufficient if your microphone is incapacitated. You can't speak because of a technical issue. So I just wanted to point that out, that I think there's some flexibility there that we can work with. Yeah, see, there you go. Council President Jones agrees. She's saying yes. There's a giant yes on her screen right now. So I think that we have some flexibility on that. I just want to throw that out there because that was the other question you folks had asked last week. So I think we do have some flexibility on that. And I think we already referenced it in there specifically, but we can visit that to make sure that flexibility is included. I'll take another look at it in the legislation.
Okay.
I think everybody agreed on that, by the way. Nobody seemed to have a huge objection to as long as we know how you're voting and it gets announced.
I believe the answer was.
Show us, President Jones. What was the answer? Can you show us again?
The answer was this.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Jokes
Mr. Green, for improving the batting average on the night.
Okay. Does anyone else have any other items they want to bring up tonight? Again, I think we'll hold this so that we can get a substitute version with a number of these changes so that folks can see them and not just go through my rambling notes. Any other points that folks would like to have on this discussion tonight? Okay, seeing none, I will move that we hold this in committee and ask for a second. Okay, all those in favor, please say aye, thumbs up, or other nonverbal communication that is affirmative. Aye, all right. That is 2-0, and we will end intergovernmental relations at 8:39. Thank you, everyone.